The role of Apollo's messengers, the chosen intermediaries of a god whose voice thundered through the veins of ancient Greece, was far more harrowing than any modern mind could dare imagine. From the moment they were selected, these individuals were thrust into a world where divine expectation mingled with mortal terror, a world where failure was not merely frowned upon, it was punished with a cruelty that seems almost unimaginable to our contemporary sensibilities. These messengers were not mere conveyors of information. They were vessels, living conduits through which the inscrutable will of Apollo itself could pour. Every word they spoke, every gesture, every sign they interpreted in the sanctuaries had to be flawless, for any deviation could trigger consequences both immediate and unspeakably severe. Ancient sources whisper of messengers being subjected to prolonged isolation, confined in the shadowed chambers of the temples, where the walls themselves seemed to hum with divine disapproval. The air would thicken with incense, and the pungent tang of sacrifices, an oppressive atmosphere designed to instill both reverence and terror. Here, a single misstep could result in more than mere reprimand. It could lead to physical mutilation or public humiliation, intended to remind all who dared approach the oracle that Apollo's reach was absolute and his wrath immediate. The very act of walking from the inner sanctum to deliver a prophecy was perilous, as rumors abound of messengers who vanished on these journeys, their fates unrecorded but forever feared, leaving only whispered tales of divine retribution for those who displeased the god. This was a realm where human comprehension collided with the incomprehensible, where the psyche was tested and reshaped under the god's unyielding gaze. Scholars suggest that these extreme measures were not merely for maintaining authority, but to create an aura of inescapable dread, ensuring that every utterance was imbued with an otherworldly weight. Messengers often oscillated between profound awe and crippling fear. The lines between devotion and terror blurred until both became inseparable. It is said that some, unable to endure the psychological strain, succumbed to madness, wandering the sacred precincts like hollow shells of those they had once been. Even the most stoic priests could not resist the oppressive atmosphere, and many recorded accounts of oracles' attendants describe trembling hands, hollowed eyes, and whispers of impending doom that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. One can only imagine the suffocating grip of living under a god's direct observation, where each prophecy carried not just political weight, but existential peril. And yet, despite the horrors, the messengers persisted, driven by devotion, fear, or a complex amalgamation of both, binding themselves to a service that was both revered and lethal. As we peer into these ancient practices, it becomes apparent that Apollo's messengers were ensnared in a delicate, dangerous dance where their survival depended as much on obedience and skill as on the capricious will of the deity they served. It is within this harrowing context that we begin to understand the darker undercurrents of the Greek religious world, a reality where divine favor was both coveted and terrifying, and where a simple message could cost a human life. The next time you consider the word oracle, imagine not a wise, serene figure imparting gentle guidance, but a trembling human, burdened with mortal fragility, walking the knife edge between celestial command and annihilation. If you found this glimpse into the shadows of ancient Greece intriguing, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, smash that like button, and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden horrors of antiquity. The Delphic oracle, perched atop the rugged slopes of Mount Parnassus, was a labyrinth of mystery and secrecy, a place where mortal comprehension faltered beneath the weight of divine expectation. The rituals performed within its sacred confines were shrouded in enigma, cloaked deliberately in layers of symbolism and arcane procedure designed to separate the ordinary from the chosen. Priests and attendants worked in concert with the messengers, but even they often did not know the full scope of the ceremonies, for the instructions came directly from the unseen hand of Apollo, transmitted through cryptic signs and whispered commands. Accounts from classical writers hint at an intricate sequence of rites that included the consumption of intoxicating fumes, precise recitations of hymns, and the careful arrangement of sacred objects, all calibrated to align the human mind with the will of the god. The messengers themselves were required to internalize these rituals with obsessive fidelity, for any lapse could invoke not merely divine displeasure, but the wrath of those tasked with enforcing the sanctity of the process. Even the atmosphere of the temple contributed to the psychological intensity. The air was thick with the scent of burning laurel and crushed herbs, shadows shifted unnaturally across carved stone walls, and the echoes of distant chants seemed to emanate from nowhere yet everywhere at once. Some historians speculate that the deliberately disorienting environment was meant to break down the messenger's sense of self, ensuring that only the voice of Apollo remained dominant in their consciousness. Rituals often culminated in a moment of suspended tension, where a single movement or utterance could determine the messenger's fate. Failure, even in interpretation or timing, could trigger violent reprisals or ritualized punishments, leaving a permanent mark on the survivor's psyche. The secrecy surrounding these practices was so absolute that the Delphic precinct became a place simultaneously revered and feared, a locus where human and divine boundaries dissolved into one terrifying continuum. Reports suggest that many messengers, having survived the inner trials of the oracle, carried back to the outside world an indelible sense of awe and dread, a mental burden that few could share without endangering themselves or others. The complexity of these rituals reinforced the oracle's authority, creating a mystique that no rational explanation could pierce, and ensuring that both rulers and commoners approached its pronouncements with trembling reverence. Within this secretive environment, the Delphic oracle cultivated an aura of omnipotence, a presence that transformed simple messages into instruments of power, fear, and sometimes death. The veiled mechanics of these sacred rites remain, even now, a chilling reminder of how the interplay between faith, ritual, and human vulnerability could be manipulated to maintain absolute control over those who dared speak for a god. Ancient accounts provide haunting glimpses into the punishments that awaited those who failed to meet Apollo's exacting standards, revealing a dimension of cruelty that modern readers often struggle to comprehend. Messengers who misinterpreted signs, delayed in delivering their prophecies, or displayed hesitation were often subjected to rituals that teetered between the sacred and the sadistic, a calculated blend designed to enforce obedience and instill fear. Some texts describe confinement in subterranean chambers beneath the temple, where darkness was absolute and the air thick with the stench of decaying offerings and incense, creating a suffocating environment meant to unmoor the mind. Here, messengers were left alone for days, sometimes weeks, with only their own thoughts and the oppressive knowledge that any lapse could invoke fatal consequences. Other sources recount more corporeal forms of punishment: whipping, ritualized beatings, or the ceremonial mutilation of hair and nails, acts that transformed the body into a testament of divine displeasure. In particularly extreme cases, failure could result in expulsion from the sanctuary, a symbolic and literal casting out that left the messenger vulnerable to both human and supernatural retribution. Chroniclers of the time frequently note the psychological torment that accompanied these punishments. The deliberate manipulation of fear, uncertainty, and shame, which bound the messenger ever tighter to Apollo's will. The ancient world did not view such measures as barbarity. They were understood as necessary calibrations of spiritual alignment, harsh yet divinely sanctioned. Messengers themselves sometimes internalized the terror so completely that even in the absence of punishment, the mere prospect of error generated profound anxiety, altering behavior in ways that ensured almost ritualistic compliance. The cumulative effect of these practices was a culture where the boundaries between mortal suffering and divine justice blurred, and where messengers carried an almost unbearable burden. Their own survival hinged on a perfect attunement to the God they served. Stories passed down through generations recount individuals who went mad, wept uncontrollably, or even took their own lives rather than face the judgment of Apollo. Yet, paradoxically, the same traditions celebrated those who endured, praising the resilience and fortitude of individuals capable of withstanding the god's terror. Political and military leaders, too, became acutely aware of these dynamics, recognizing that the oracle's authority rested not only on divine insight, but on the very real and often brutal enforcement mechanisms imposed upon those who delivered its messages. Each account reinforces a chilling truth. In the world of the Delphic oracle, obedience was inseparable from fear, and fear was inseparable from the god's perceived omnipotence. The messengers, bound to this invisible yet palpable law, moved through their duties as though on the edge of a blade, their every action weighed by the specter of divine reprisal, their every word capable of invoking life or death. In this way, the sacred and the horrific intertwined, leaving a legacy that haunts our understanding of ancient Greek spirituality. The psychological manipulation imposed upon Apollo's messengers was as potent as any physical punishment, a subtle yet relentless form of control that left indelible marks on the mind. Within the shadowed chambers of the temple, rituals were designed to erode the messenger's sense of autonomy, fostering and right ever-present fear that the god's wrath was immediate and inescapable. Priests and temple attendants often orchestrated this atmosphere with calculated precision, shifting shadows cast by flickering torches, sudden bursts of incense, and the murmured chants that seemed to originate from the very stones themselves. Messengers were expected to interpret these cues with exacting precision, knowing that a single misjudgment could trigger a chain of consequences, both spiritual and corporeal. Many chroniclers describe the near-constant state of anxiety experienced by these individuals, a tension so acute that even the act of leaving the temple carried a palpable sense of dread. Stories recount messengers pacing the sanctuaries in the dead of night, their hands trembling, voices hushed as they rehearsed prophecies over and over in a desperate attempt to align with what they believed was Apollo's will. In some cases, these mental torments were amplified by deliberate isolation, cutting the messengers off from any familiar support or comforting human interaction. The effect was an almost ritualized self-surveillance, where the fear of divine reprisal became internalized and every thought, movement, and word was scrutinized as if under the god's immediate gaze. Temple records, when interpreted alongside classical accounts, suggest that some messengers developed physical symptoms, insomnia, trembling, palpitations, as the constant psychic pressure transformed into somatic distress. It is within these shadows that we glimpse the full extent of the oracular system, a web of fear and psychological dominance designed to enforce obedience and sanctify the pronouncements delivered to the outside world. The terror instilled in these messengers extended far beyond their personal suffering. It reinforced the oracle's reputation, amplifying the perception that Apollo's voice was infallible and that the punishment for missteps was both swift and severe. Even rulers who sought guidance from Delphi approached the oracle with trembling caution, aware that the messenger's fear was a reflection of divine authority itself. In contemplating these manipulations, we are confronted with a grim truth. The oracle's power was as much psychological as it was spiritual, wielded not through overt threat alone, but through the pervasive, almost invisible presence of terror that haunted every step of a messenger's path. Reflect on this chilling orchestration of mind and spirit, and share your thoughts in the comments below. How could human beings endure such a relentless grip of fear and devotion? Stories of inexplicable deaths and disappearances among Apollo's messengers cast a long shadow over the Delphic sanctuaries, hinting at forces both human and divine that were beyond comprehension. Ancient texts recount messengers who embarked on their missions with courage, only to vanish without a trace, leaving behind no evidence except the lingering sense of horror that would haunt the temple corridors for decades. Some sources suggest that these deaths were the result of divine retribution, sudden illnesses, or accidents orchestrated by unseen hands, all interpreted as Apollo's judgment on inadequacy or hesitation. There are accounts of messengers found lifeless in the sacred precincts, their bodies contorted as if in the throes of a final unseen struggle, while others were said to disappear entirely during journeys between city-states, leaving only whispered tales of godly vengeance to terrify future aspirants. The ambiguity of these events served a chilling purpose. The line between fate, divine will, and human cruelty blurred so thoroughly that no one could feel secure. Some chroniclers speculate that rivalries among priests or local authorities may have contributed to these tragedies, exploiting the aura of divine involvement to settle earthly scores. Messengers, aware of these precedents, internalized an almost supernatural paranoia, realizing that any error could result in sudden, irreversible consequences. The fear of vanishing, whether by human malice or divine mandate, became a constant companion, shaping every decision, every gesture, every spoken word. Even those who survived these experiences carried scars, psychological and sometimes physical, that would define the remainder of their lives. The stories persisted in oral tradition and later texts, reinforcing the sacred and terrifying reputation of the Delphic oracle. Politicians and generals consulted the oracle with a mix of awe and trepidation, recognizing that the seemingly prophetic authority of the temple rested as much on the messenger's fear and vulnerability as on the god's insight. Within this web of mortality and divine expectation, the messengers became symbols of the ultimate cost of serving a god whose standards were unknowable and whose judgment could strike without warning. In this way, each disappearance and death served both as a warning and as a reinforcement of the god's terrifying omnipresence, ensuring that the legacy of Apollo's wrath would endure for generations. The very fabric of Greek spiritual life was interwoven with these narratives, creating a culture where belief and dread were inseparable, and where the cost of divine service could be measured in vanished lives. The influence of the Delphic oracle extended far beyond the temple walls, shaping political and military decisions across the Greek world, often at a tremendous human cost. Kings, generals, and city-state leaders approached the messengers with a mixture of reverence and fear, understanding that each prophecy carried weight not only in strategy but in life and death. The messengers, aware of this immense responsibility, navigated a precarious path. Their interpretations could determine the fate of armies, the survival of leaders, or the downfall of entire cities. Some sources recount leaders altering their military campaigns entirely based on a single pronouncement, leading to disastrous outcomes. Yet the oracle's authority remained unchallenged, reinforced by the aura of divine omniscience and the fear of the messengers themselves. The stories of such influence are rife with examples of human suffering, from soldiers marching into ambushes to citizens paying exorbitant tributes or enduring harsh decrees, all justified by the messages relayed through trembling, terrified intermediaries. Messengers became the silent bearers of immense power, their words carrying consequences they could neither control nor fully comprehend, and their failures, real or perceived, echoed through the political and social fabric of the city-states. In some accounts, the psychological strain on messengers was magnified by direct exposure to the ambitions and manipulations of rulers, who sought to exploit the oracle's authority for personal gain. This fusion of divine consultation and human machination created a system where terror, devotion, and political strategy intertwined, ensuring that the oracle's influence remained absolute. The weight of responsibility on the messengers was staggering. A single mispronounced word could lead to catastrophic decisions, a city's downfall, or the slaughter of innocents. Even surviving such an ordeal left deep scars, as messengers carried the memory of bloodshed linked directly to their service. The Delphic oracle's reach thus illustrates a chilling dynamic. Divine authority and human ambition coalesced into a force capable of reshaping history, and the messengers were trapped in the eye of this storm, ever aware that their lives and sanity hung by the thinnest thread of interpretation. The terrifying power wielded through these intermediaries reminds us that the ancient Greeks' reverence for oracles was not merely spiritual, but existential, a world in which fear, obedience, and fate were inseparably bound. The sanctity of Apollo was enforced with an intensity that often bordered on the ruthless, a reality that left messengers walking a precarious line between devotion and annihilation. The god's wrath was not a distant concept, but a tangible force, channeled through the very instruments of his service. Messengers who faltered, whether through error, hesitation, or perceived disrespect, faced consequences that were as immediate as they were terrifying. Some accounts describe ritualized punishments so meticulously structured that they became almost ceremonial, blending elements of fear, awe, and physical suffering to ensure total compliance. Within the inner sanctum of the temple, attendants monitored every gesture, every syllable, interpreting the smallest deviation as a signal of divine disfavor. These enforcements were not arbitrary. They served as a vivid demonstration to all who entered the sacred precincts that Apollo's will was absolute, and that the god's voice could strike without warning. Historical sources recount instances where messengers endured days of confinement, the walls of the chambers echoing with whispered warnings and incantations that heightened their anxiety, leaving them hyper-aware of the divine presence. In some cases, the punishments escalated to physical trials, from symbolic lashings to acts that blurred the line between discipline and torment, reinforcing a culture of fear that permeated every level of temple service. The terror was both protective and pervasive. It safeguarded the oracle's authority while binding the messengers ever tighter to Apollo's demands. Even the most stoic individuals could not resist the cumulative weight of psychological and ritualized pressure, and many were permanently altered by the experience, their devotion inseparable from the trauma inflicted in the god's name. The broader message was unmistakable. To serve Apollo was to live under the constant, vigilant gaze of a deity whose mercy was rare and whose wrath was swift. Messengers became living symbols of this divine rigor, their trembling obedience a testament to the power wielded by the oracles, a power that shaped political decisions, influenced armies, and dictated the fates of countless lives. In contemplating these extremes, we recognize the terrifying precision with which sacred authority could be enforced, a system in which fear was both instrument and message. The human cost was immense, yet the aura of inevitability cemented the gods' dominion over mortals, leaving a chilling legacy of devotion intertwined with horror. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How could such extreme reverence shape the minds and lives of those chosen to speak for a god? Comparisons with other ancient religious practices reveal that the punishment of messengers was not unique to Apollo's cult. Yet the intensity and psychological depth of these measures stand out as particularly chilling. In Egypt, priests sometimes used ritualized isolation or fasting to prepare individuals for divine communication, yet few accounts describe the same pervasive fear of immediate annihilation. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, diviners underwent elaborate ceremonies to interpret the will of the gods, yet the physical and psychological rigor imposed on Apollo's messengers seems to exceed what was common elsewhere. Even within Greek religion itself, the starkness of Delphi's approach was exceptional, creating an environment where obedience was enforced not only by tradition, but by terror. Scholars note that while other sacred intermediaries faced dangers, whether from political manipulation or the consequences of misinterpreted omens, the combination of ritual, psychological conditioning, and the constant threat of death at Delphi produced an unparalleled form of human control. Messengers became, in effect, instruments of both divine communication and social regulation, their fear ensuring that the pronouncements they delivered were accepted without question, reinforcing the god's authority across city-states. Some accounts suggest that this intensity fostered extraordinary skill and precision among the messengers, but at a tremendous human cost, leaving lasting psychological scars that often persisted long after their service ended. This intersection of divine expectation and human vulnerability highlights a fundamental tension in ancient spiritual practices. The very individuals charged with transmitting sacred knowledge were simultaneously at risk of being destroyed by it. By examining these parallels, we see a recurring theme across cultures, the use of extreme measures to guarantee fidelity to the gods, but Delphi stands out for the comprehensive integration of fear, ritual, and existential threat. The message is unmistakable. The more terrifying the mechanism, the more unquestioned the authority it enforces. In understanding this, we also gain insight into the broader social impact of religious institutions in antiquity, where belief was inseparable from the human cost incurred to maintain it. The legacy of these practices endures as a stark reminder that devotion, when intertwined with fear, can become both a source of awe and a mechanism of control, shaping societies and individuals in ways that are simultaneously profound and horrifying. The boundary between divine wrath and human cruelty in the practices surrounding Apollo's messengers was often indistinguishable, leaving observers and participants alike uncertain where godly judgment ended and human enforcement began. Messengers frequently bore the full weight of both forces, subjected to punishments that were framed as divine mandates, but orchestrated through human hands with meticulous attention to fear and suffering. Ancient accounts describe scenarios in which attendants, believing themselves instruments of Apollo's will, administered torturous disciplines, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical, under the claim of ensuring fidelity to the god's voice. The psychological toll was immense. Messengers internalized a terror that blurred reality, leading some to believe that the god himself directly imposed every humiliation or threat. This merging of mortal enforcement with the concept of divine retribution created a pervasive culture of dread, where every action, hesitation, or misinterpretation could invite ruin. Observers from other city-states recorded stories of messengers who fell into despair, becoming mere shadows of their former selves, their minds haunted by visions of punishment, both real and imagined. In these accounts, the human facilitators of divine law became almost indistinguishable from the God they served, embodying a terrifying fusion of authority and cruelty. Scholars examining these patterns suggest that the effectiveness of the oracle depended not solely on the supposed prophetic insight, but on the systematic inculcation of fear, creating a chain of command where obedience was guaranteed through terror. It was a psychological architecture designed to ensure that no message, however subtle or politically inconvenient, could be delivered incorrectly. Messengers existed in a constant state of hyper-awareness, their consciousness finely tuned to both the unseen expectations of Apollo and the visible scrutiny of the temple attendants. In such an environment, the line between divine and human punishment dissolved entirely, and the consequences of failure were magnified by the interwoven presence of both. The resulting experience was one of relentless anxiety, where mortal hands enacted what was believed to be divine will, yet the suffering inflicted left no doubt of its very human agency. Ultimately, this complex entanglement of fear, devotion, and brutality highlights the terrifying sophistication of the Delphic system, a realm in which belief and obedience were enforced through a seamless, almost invisible blend of mortal and divine power, and where the cost of failure was always paid in full, whether by body, mind, or soul. Reflecting on the dark practices surrounding Apollo's messengers, it becomes clear that the Delphic oracle was not merely a source of guidance, but a crucible of human endurance, shaping minds and destinies under the relentless gaze of divine expectation. Every step taken by a messenger, every word spoken in service of the god, carried consequences that transcended the mortal plane, blending fear, devotion, and survival into a singular, inescapable experience. Historical records portray individuals whose lives were defined by trembling, obedience, whose identities became intertwined with the god's will, and whose survival depended on mastering the intricate rituals, psychological pressures, and spiritual expectations imposed upon them. The deaths, disappearances, and psychological torment endured by these messengers reveal the immense human cost of serving a god whose authority was enforced as much through terror as through inspiration. Across centuries, the stories of these intermediaries have fascinated and horrified in equal measure, reminding us that ancient spirituality was not merely contemplative, but often brutally exacting. The interplay of divine omnipotence and mortal fragility created a system in which obedience was guaranteed, not through gentle persuasion, but through a terrifying orchestration of ritualized fear and psychological manipulation. And yet, despite these horrors, the messengers persisted, their courage and suffering ensuring that Apollo's voice remained both revered and feared across Greece. The legacy of this terrifying dynamic endures in our understanding of ancient religion, a stark reminder that devotion and dread can coexist in ways that profoundly shape human behavior. As we close this exploration into the shadows of Delphi, consider the immense weight carried by those chosen to speak for a god, and the chilling precision with which their world was governed. If this journey into the hidden horrors of ancient Greece captivated you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Hit the like button, subscribe for more dark histories, and prepare to uncover the next story in our series, another glimpse into the haunting and often brutal world of ancient civilizations.